on a whiteboard, on a piece of paper, draw all of your channels to market. How many steps are there on this value chain? How many possible different ways are there? Because until you know that, you can't possibly say how things should be priced into these different channel partners.
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for on eBay.
Man, it's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the sometimes indirect relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving. Today, our guest is Ben Blaney. Here are 3 things you want to know about Ben before we start. He has broad experience in pricing, including stints at GE, Colfax, and Pros. He is currently VP of Pre-Sales at Vendavo, and he has lived in 8 countries, more than most of us have even visited. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Hey, it's going to be fun. How'd you get into pricing?
Funnily enough, it was related to the conversation you and I had a little while ago. I worked in government contracting where, my joke is you don't know a tough customer until you've had the government as your customer who can literally make a law about how you can price to them. So you have to get super creative with the government. And I found ways of getting creative with pricing. I didn't know I was pricing, but apparently I was. And that was the way it all started.
Isn't it funny how almost everything is pricing, even though you don't realize it's pricing?
That's exactly it. I mean, it's, any transaction, any successful sale has been priced. And so, I feel like when people are talking about digital transformation, sales transformation, unless they're thinking about pricing being right in the middle of it, they're missing something.
Yeah. And instead of pricing, I use the word pricing a lot. I love it. But I often go back to the word value because that's the fulcrum of everything we're talking about is how do we create, communicate, and capture more value through our pricing. So,
yeah, that's right. I agree.
Why do you stay in pricing?
I suppose you get to a point where, you've established some base of knowledge and expertise, and you've established some kind of reputation and experience and a Rolodex. And so at that point, stasis becomes easier than motion, doesn't it? And so that's probably the kind of basic answer. But the truth is, I do still find it interesting. And I do believe, just as I said a moment ago, that it's the pivotal thing. It's fundamental to any commercial activity. And people don't give it its proper credence. And so I'm happy to be part of, moving the needle on the world's knowledge of how this matters.
Yeah. And not only that, it feels to me like most people don't understand pricing. They don't know what it means. They don't really give it the attention it deserves. And so people like you and I can have so much impact in a company with the things that we can teach them and help them with.
Yeah, I think one of the problems, and even pricing people, I'll do it today, almost certainly, maybe you will too. I think it behooves all of us to define, whenever we say price, to define what price that is. Is it an interstock price? Is it a channel price? Is it a customer price? Is it a list price, a country price? Is it a negotiated price? Is it, I kind of feel like the word price always needs a word before it or after it, because otherwise you can quickly become confused about what we're talking about.
Yep, I agree completely. So I asked you, what are you passionate about in pricing? And first off, you said it's hard to answer that question. And then you gave me a few choices. And we decided we were going to talk about channel pricing. But what you really said was channel selling, channel management, and of course, channel pricing. So why did you lump all 3 of those together when we say, well, let's talk about channel pricing?
Yeah, because I think that channels in general are enormously underserved, recognized, understood in organizations. And so what happens is companies who sell through channels or companies who are the channel, because they don't recognize the part in the value chain from A to Z, failing to understand what the value chain is, the different mechanisms of getting to market means, you hit on it. You like to talk about pricing, but it's all about value. To understand the value a channel brings to you, say a manufacturer, that's the only thing that tells you how you should price to and through the channel. And people shy away from it because it's difficult. I think structurally also, channel management in large organizations, I worked at GE, big channel selling in the division I worked in, channel management is a function, and it's largely administrative, largely legal, compliance and agreements and all those things. And so there was this governance unit who didn't really do much about price, didn't do anything about pricing. And then the people who might be involved in commercial decisions didn't want to dip their toes too far in the water because there's this other group who, you got this Venn diagram and people treading on toes. So I think channels are incredibly interesting, but also difficult. But more than that, as I think into the future, as I think about what's going to happen in the next 5 years of commercial activity and organizations of scale, channels are going to become more important. For example, you could take this conversation back 5 years. Is e-commerce a channel? Or is it a mechanism of selling direct to people? I don't think there's a right answer, but I think asking the question is incredibly important for anybody undertaking this kind of activity. So then if I take this example of e-commerce and project into the future, boy, we're expecting changes, aren't we? COVID and the pandemic has taught us that things that we thought were for good, or for certainly a good portion into the medium term, are actually much more fragile. And so we might be doing things different very soon. And how should we think about these things? So it's underserved, misunderstood, and kind of undervalued, probably.
Let's start by defining channel for anybody who doesn't really know what we're talking about, and then give me a couple examples of channels that we could use. And by the way, I used to work in the semiconductor industry. I think you did too. So we could use that as one of our examples of channels. But what is a channel?
Yeah, fundamentally, a channel is a mechanism by which you get to market. Okay, so you might be a manufacturer selling through channels to your end user. So let's throw out some kind of commonly used terms in the channel space. So one might be distributor. Okay, I would say a couple of key kind of characteristics of distributors. They take title of goods, and to some extent, they stock product, your product as the manufacturer, in their facilities to then serve your customers. So you can think of that, what's happening? You're placing inventory, you're positioning inventory closer to the customers. That's a good thing. You're using the kind of power of the multiplier by using your distributors' sales teams to do selling for you, the manufacturer. So distributor. Then you've got reseller. Okay. For me, a reseller is close to a distributor, but they might not take title and they might not stock, but they do perform these commercial functions of finding a need, perhaps organizing specification activity for engineered goods, those kinds of things. Okay. So reseller. And then I think you've got value-added reseller, where they are taking your product and surrounding it with services. Maybe, if you think about semiconductor, they might take hardware and build around software and services to present an offer, a bundle to the organization, to the ultimate customer. Okay. And so for me, these are the fundamentals of channel. And then of course, you've got the direct channel, which is your salary, W-2 employees who are salespeople selling to your direct customers for various reasons. And this complexity quickly gets intertwined, doesn't it? That, you don't want your direct salespeople making deals with customers who are the customers of your channel partners, because that's not right. But you probably make more money when you sell direct because you don't have to accommodate for the margin that has to exist in the intermediary stage. Okay, so those are a few things off the top of my head. Is that?
I think those are great examples. Great examples. So let's talk about distributors for a second. I love working with distributors. I love thinking about it. And I remember when I was in the semiconductor industry, there seemed to be an attitude of we're paying our distributors too much. How do we get another % away from them? So address that issue for me, would you?
Yeah, very happily. Yeah, this is a common feeling on the part of the seller, and I do think that that feeling is increasing over time. Why? Because I do think I consider myself a friend of the distributor community before we get angry letters or anything. But I do think as the business evolves, that you can perceive, the manufacturer may perceive that the distributor is doing less for the same compensation, i.e. the margin they can organize on a particular set of circumstances. Okay. Well, I think that represents a changing world. Okay. The world is changing faster than certainly big organizations keep up with commonly. And so what it needs is for, again, the origination, the manufacturer in my example, to think, what is the value that I want this distributor to provide? What is the value the distributor does actually provide? And what's fair compensation for that? Okay. And I think it's easy to say, oh, my distributor, they're making a load of money. It's my IP. I've got factories. I've got raw materials. I've got a supply chain. And all they do is it comes in the front door and goes out the back door. What's up with that? You have to think about the value they provide. Breaking bulk, okay, is a value. The manufacturer doesn't want to break bulk and sell individual pieces or cartons. Of course, the distributor should do it.
Yeah, and the distributor also has relationships with a lot of customers that manufacturers don't have relationships with. That's the whole reason they exist.
That's right. It's this force multiplier of if you've got a network of 1,000 distributors and each of them have 10 sellers, you've got 10,000 sellers on the street selling your product. That's a good thing. It's a force multiplier.
Yeah, the other thing that I always thought of whenever I was in these situations is what you described in terms of how much value does a distributor add. I think of that as answering the will I question. Will I use a distributor? So that's solving the problem. But the other side of that coin, which we have to think about, is the which one decision. And if you think about a distributor salesperson, they can sell this manufacturer's product or they could sell another manufacturer's product. So just because I want to cut my margin from 22 to 18 points, if the other manufacturer didn't, I'm not going to be sold. So it's not as easy as just, hey, they're giving us less value, we're gonna pay them less.
That's exactly right. Recognizing that the distributor is a for-profit organization in their own right, and they are perfectly able to make rational decisions for the health of their own business. It means we have to understand the value they bring us relative to their other options for suppliers, and what that means when the distributor deals with their customer. It's very important to unpack these things. And in my experience, I've talked to a lot of big companies who sell through distribution. They do far too little of these activities of understanding the values in the channels. And so everything can become tone deaf, can't it? To cut a margin, cut some distributor support. It's very easy to make bad decisions if you're not thinking about channels and the value they bring.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is you can almost think of selling to a distributor as selling a commodity, right? Because oftentimes in commodities, we don't have enough differentiation between our products. And that's why we think of it as a commodity. But if we're going to sell into a distributor, if we're not recognizing and helping them be more successful, we're essentially just saying, here, take my product and go sell it. It's up to you. Where the more value we can add to the distributor, the more likely they are to sell our product, the more margin we're going to get, or the smaller margin we have to give them to sell our product. So,
yeah, I agree completely. I think that analogy is nice. And if you think about what happens, how people price in commodity organizations, genuine commodities, right? Often thinking about the word that goes before the price word. Often in commodity selling, you talk about a delivered price, meaning you are accommodating for the cost of transportation to the customer organization. Well, so if we transpose that into this distributor environment, then what we're doing is we're making sure that the cost to the ultimate customer is on parity, because between us and the distributor, we're organizing, placing material where it needs to be, breaking bulk if necessary, These are important things. These are valuable to the end customer. And so they're worth, the manufacturer taking that margin out of their own pocket and putting it in the distributor because it's better for the value chain. You express better value for your end customer.
Absolutely. So we're back to value again. Let me ask, you'd mentioned this earlier, and it's always a challenge in many companies. As companies go direct more and more through e-commerce, how do they avoid competing with their distribution or channels? Whether it's a distributor or a reseller, whatever it is, that's a really hard decision.
It's a really hard decision. Yeah. And so you've seen that a lot in the last 5 years with even some quite, unusual companies selling on Amazon. Okay. Amazon being, they're a channel partner to many, many organizations. Right now, they're the biggest channel partner in the world, I would think. Okay. And so, yeah, these questions have to be considered of, okay, if I put all my products on Amazon and Amazon can deliver them next day to most people in most of the Western world, what does that do for my distributors? Now, it's a legitimate choice to say, you know what, if I've got Amazon, I don't need rinky-dink distributors in every, third biggest city in every state in the United States. Okay, that's a legitimate choice to make. However, I would encourage it to be a deliberate choice, at least. I think what happens sometimes is it's an accidental choice that someone somewhere says, we should sell on Amazon, go do that. And people say, all right, well, let's get that going. And people haven't, it's about second order effects of decision making. And so thinking that through is incredibly important. There's no right answer, I would say. But I think the key to the right answer is to think, where is this going in 3 years? Okay. If you can imagine a world in which you're wholly selling on Amazon and direct and you don't need any distributors, fine, go ahead and do it. Okay. But if you think you might need distributors to perform, back to value, services that Amazon won't provide, then you're going to keep your distributors for certain things. In which case, what does that look like? Maybe your distributor needs to morph themselves into a reseller or a value-added reseller from being a distributor because they can't win against Amazon at holding stock and having a logistics network to do the last mile in 24 hours. Okay, but these are big conversations to have, and people aren't having them.
It feels like the B2C distributors are in much bigger trouble than the B2B distributors are today. Would you agree with that or no?
I think so, yes. I think it's, I would say that I agree with that today. I think there's an increasing B2B2C phenomenon occurring, isn't there? That even companies who think of themselves as B2B are beginning to recognize that there's a next step at some point. And so they are starting to think about how to solve that problem, if you want to call it a problem. And yeah, pure B2B companies. I mean, you think of, go back to process industry and commodity chemicals like polyethylene. Okay, I've dealt with a bunch of polyethylene organizations in the world, and you sell these things to anyone who makes anything out of plastic, and they melt them down and turn them into other plastic. They want it to be, okay, you've probably got a bit more time. You're probably not going to sell your polyethylene chips on Amazon. Not today, perhaps. But could it happen? Well, maybe, because your plastic manufacturer who's making whatever they're making out of plastic, maybe they want to buy differently at some point. And, everyone wants to buy quickly. Everyone wants to buy mobile enabled. And so, yeah, maybe there is a market for that to happen by e-commerce that we're not ready for. But I don't think I know what's going to happen yet.
I think that's a pretty fair statement. If I were an engineer designing a board and I wanted some semiconductors, I'd probably just go online and order them. I probably wouldn't go through a distribution channel to go find them or talk to a salesperson to go get them. Like, yeah, this is what I want.
That's right. I think the exception to that, I would argue, for fun, is if you're designing a board and you need a chip to go on it, a reason to go to a distributor is, and I deal with a couple of electronics distributors, as you know, is that the distributor has engineering resources on the board side rather than on the manufacturing side. Okay, engineering resources at the semiconductor manufacturer are focused on what they're focused on, reducing the size and power throughputs and those kinds of things. How many transistors can you get on a 17 micron square? Engineers on the distribution side are much more about application engineering, which is a value-added service. And so what you see actually all the way through that semiconductor value chain is an end user, an OEM, maybe the people who make fridges or the people who make cars, thousands of chips in a car now, aren't there? They're going to the distributor saying, I need a chip that does roughly this thing, and I want it to perform this function in my product. Help me out. Give me a sample. Give me 10 of those and 10 of those and 10 of those. You wouldn't get that if you went direct to a manufacturer because they'll give you their 10, yep. But you might want to sample different ones. So there's always an option for a function to be fulfilled by a distributor, I think.
And I think the real point that you just made is that the service matters. If I'm going to offer you a service of helping you with design, helping you with the application, I'm going to end up getting paid for it. You're going to go through my sales channel, whatever that looks like. So
yeah, that's right. I mean, and the moment that the distributor fails to understand that the distributor has this function to provide over and above what can be provided by the manufacturer, that's the moment at which they are obsoleting themselves as a step in the value chain. I'll give you an example, which is when I worked at GE. I won't name the organization, but I worked at GE and selling through channels, through specifying engineers, and our people, we're the manufacturer, remember, our people were asked to go to a first meeting with an end user customer. Why? Because the distributor didn't have the engineering skills to be able to mediate this conversation. So at that point, they're really just a brokerage rather than a distributor. They're just saying, oh, here's a guy who wants to buy something. There's a guy who's got, you guys should talk. And I'll take, let's be clear, what was a very healthy number. And that did raise that question for me as the manufacturer to say, well, hang on a minute. If they sell this thing at my list price, which is, I'm hoping they will do, they'll make this much margin, and I'm going to make this much margin, which is less, and they really not doing much here. That's a distributor who needs to evolve and kind of step up to their role, or say to themselves, you know what, I don't want to do that engineering specification. I'll just be a brokerage and I'll take a flat 10% for connecting these two people with a phone call.
Yeah, I think another thing you just pointed out that was really interesting and important is who owns the customer. In the past, it's always been the channel that's been closest to the customer, and they own the customer, and manufacturers are trying to find ways through registrations or warranty cards or whatever it is to get the names of their customers. And so I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, these are often, this is this not necessarily dysfunction, but it can be dysfunction between the channel management and administration function and the pricing function. Because, the channel management function, who's maintaining the legal agreements between the organizations, and then you've got marketing involved saying, look, let me send warranty cards, let me scrape this information, and maybe in the future we'll have these customers and we'll sell to them direct. And the channel organization, well, no, I don't know if that really is appropriate, if that's permissible within the terms of our agreement. These are serious conversations to be had by leaders in an organization, but they're hard, they're difficult, and people don't have them.
Yeah. So I think everybody's got to figure out who that end customer is and start to try to own them to the best of their ability. That's where the future is going to be.
That's right. It's the focus, the relentless, obsessive focus on what the end customer needs and wants is going to distinguish the winners in channels from the losers.
Speaking of this relentless focus on the end customer, when I teach people to price through a channel, what I always teach them is start at the end customer. What's that end customer willing to pay? And now how much do I have to give each channel partner, right? As I work my way back. Is that how you would approach it? Would you do something different?
I think that's certainly a legitimate way. And I think that the benefit of your method is to say, look, if I need to present a unified market price to possible buyers, what you're doing, your method avoids channel conflict. If you say, look, all end customers need to pay $100 for this thing. If I sell it through a channel, I sell it to them for 70 and they sell it for 100, make 30. If I sell it, I sell it for 100 and so on. So you're creating this unified price in the marketplace. That's a good thing. And I'm perfectly okay with that. I think the step I'm particularly interested in is, okay, I want it to be 100 no matter how the end customer buys, I want it to be 100. Okay, well, what do I feel is an appropriate margin for the distributors to make relative to the reseller? They've taken title, they've held stock, they've broken bulk, they've helped with design and specification. Reseller took an order. What's a different level of compensation? So that drives how I sell to them, knowing that they want to make a certain amount, but then I try to kind of influence them to make sure the $100 out price is still valid. So it's a couple of steps in the same process. I find it helpful to think about these things in a waterfall construct, okay? To say, in a number of circumstances, here's how it flows, and here's the difference. And it's a visual. Despite being a pricer and sort of above averagely numerate, I would hope, I like a visual on these things.
I think that was a spot on answer, though. I loved it. Actually not last question, but second to last question. I always struggle with cost plus pricing. So I rail against cost plus. I just love value-based pricing. I define it as charge what your customers are willing to pay. And yet when you have organizations that have 100,000 SKUs, they're going to use cost plus pricing. What would you advise them? And when I say these organizations, I'm typically thinking distribution channels, things like that.
Yeah, it's the compelling issue. And, frankly, we haven't seen enough progress in this area in the 20 years I've been kind of monitoring it. And I'm sure you feel the same, that, if you go to a conference now, you'll still hear people talking about, oh, don't do cost plus pricing, do value pricing. And it shouldn't be news at this point, but you're right. People are still struggling with making that shift. And I would say one of the steps is, I don't know, I can't remember the last time I met a business of any kind who had no channel implications at all. And so one of the steps I want to kind of insert into that process of a shift from cost plus pricing to value-based pricing is, okay, well, let's first establish the mechanisms by which you get to market, which channels are involved, and then inside channels, which players are involved, and what are the differences between them, and how can we appropriately recognize those things in our pursuit to extract maximum willingness to pay, both from them and from their customer to them. It's not a zero-sum game here. If you can help your channel partner make money, they will lean to you. And so helping them do that is for me, the kind of keys to the kingdom.
I think that brings us back to what we talked about earlier in the day. The question I'm really asking on distributors, which I'd love to hear your thought on, is when we would sell semiconductors to a distributor, they said, hey, we're going to do 21-point margin. And in fact, at one point in time, I took a distributor and I tore down all their prices relative to the prices that we sold it to them at. And we could create a formula and says, this is exactly how they're doing their pricing, right? It's cost plus based on volume. And I knew it precisely. But what I'd love to coach them on is, how do you take some parts and charge more margin for those because you can get away with it, and take other parts and take less margin because you can't get away with it?
Yeah, I mean, it's especially in semiconductor, the count of SKUs and the volumes of these SKUs are kind of off the charts. And I always find you have to do a lot of data cleansing, don't you, in semi, because you're going to have these, you're going to have samples, just as we discussed. If I'm an engineer at Ford designing the new, Focus or whatever, I want a few samples, and I might pay for them, I might not, and they might be extremely high prices. Another example of that is in the meter business, meters on the side of the house for electricity and gas. That's an oligopoly. Most people don't know it's an oligopoly. And of course, homeowners don't choose their meter. All right. But what happens is the meter companies buy the other meter companies' meters to pull them apart. And they're the only people who pay the actual list price. So if you dive into meter company data, you'll find a sale of a quantity of 5. These are usually quantities of 1 million, right? Because you're doing, whole cities, right? So you'll find a quantity of 5 that are more profitable than a quantity sold of 1 million, because that was the competitor. The car companies do it as well, don't they? Ferrari buy the new Lamborghini and BMW buy the new Mercedes, and they pull them apart. Okay. But they're not getting discounts, are they? Right. So you've got it. Cleaning this data is really, really a kind of early step that always kind of makes me laugh.
Yeah, this is fun. Ben, we're running out of time, but we got to have the last question. What's the one piece of pricing advice you would give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
Yeah, well, as it pertains to channels in particular, which is, it's my relentless and obsessive focus is channels, is I often ask people to, as a very first step, draw. I mean, I miss whiteboards now, we're in this COVID world, but, on a whiteboard, on a piece of paper, draw all of your channels to market. Here's my intermediary, here's my end customer. How many steps are there on this value chain? How many possible different ways are there? Okay, because until you know that, you can't possibly say how things should be priced into these different channel partners. And then you're asking the question you asked earlier, which is, do I start with the end price, or do I price in and let them build up their prices and hope they wind up at where I want them to wind up? So understand channels, draw it, make it a picture. Here's me, here's my intermediaries, here's all the ways it could work. And then here's the ways I want it to work. I like this channel. I don't want to sell like this. I do want to do more of that. I think the future is here. I think customers want to do it like this. That visual will tell you everything you need to do next.
Phenomenal answer. And I just want to give you a little hint, Ben. Amazon sells whiteboards.
I should, yeah. I should. And the trouble is, if I did, would I ever be at my computer? I'd always be whiteboarding something.
Right. Ben, thank you so much for your time today. If anyone wants to contact you, how can they do that?
Pretty easy to find on LinkedIn. It's Ben Blaney, Blaney. And love to hear from anyone. Excellent.
Episode 101 is all finished. Would you please leave us a review for this episode or all of our episodes? We hugely appreciate them. They're very valuable to us. MJ141317 left us a review that said, awesome content. I can't wait to see more episodes. Please join our community at Champions of Value. You'll find that at community.championsofvalue.com. That's where we post all of our free content, the memes, the blogs, the videos, the podcasts. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast or pricing in general, feel free to email me, Mark at impactpricing.com. Now, go make it impact.